Shalom and welcome to LeRaglai Jewish Ministries, where we teach the Bible from a Jewish historical, cultural, and linguistic perspective. As we begin this teaching, this is part 3 in our teaching series on the book of Revelation. And we're at a important place here in the book because we have finished the first half of the book and we're going into the second half, right? We finished chapters 1 to 11, and now we're going into chapters 12 to 22. So chapter-wise, we're right in the middle of the book. And this teaching will be focused on Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 to 12, and we'll be finishing chapter 12 in the next one or two teachings. I've titled this teaching, On Earth as It Is in Heaven. So as always, we want to think about the context of this chapter, right? What are we looking at as we think about the context of Revelation chapter 12? Now, we just finished Revelation chapter 11, verses 15 and 19 in the previous teaching, which focused on the seventh trumpet, the sounding of the seventh trumpet. We spent a lot of time on this because we see how it's very climactic in the book of Revelation. Now, we also know that the seventh trumpet announces the completion of the mystery of God and the second coming, right? And so let me just read Revelation 10:7 again, where it says, "But in the days of the voice of the seventh angel, when he is about to sound, then the mystery of God is finished, as he preached to his servants, the prophets," right? And we talked about how this blast of the seventh trumpet and ushers in the days of the sounding of the seventh trumpet. It's a very significant time in the book, and basically this carries through all the way to almost the end of the book. The days of the seventh trumpet are not completed until Revelation 19, even going into the beginning of Revelation 20. So it's really the majority of the second half of the book of Revelation. Now, as we enter into chapters 12 and 13, and even going into 14, we're going into this third interlude, right? This pause. Now, we've already seen two interludes. We saw the first interlude back in Revelation chapter 7, which was in between the sixth and seventh seals. And then the second interlude was in Revelation chapters 10:1 through 11:14, and that was in between the sixth and seventh trumpets. And now we're entering into this third interlude, which is Revelation chapters 12 and 13, and we could say 14 as well. We'll look at that more when we get to it. That kind of transitions into 15, which is clearly getting back into the time frame of the days of the seventh trumpet, right? And as we have already seen in the first and second interlude, more information is being provided about the time or the end times in general, or even specifically regarding the Great Tribulation, right? And the same thing here in Revelation chapters 12 and 13. More information is being given. Now, Revelation chapters 12 and 13 provide unique details regarding spiritual warfare in general, as well as the Great Tribulation. And we'll see how that worked out, especially here in Revelation chapter 12 regarding spiritual warfare. Now, something I realized as I was preparing for this teaching is how Revelation chapters 4 to 11 focus mostly on the acts of God, whereas Revelation chapters 12 and 13 focus mostly on the acts of Satan. And I don't want to say this in a black and white way, right? There are always acts of God within chapters 12 and 13, and there are acts of Satan within Revelation chapters 4 to 11. But I'm saying the majority, the focus, we see the acts of God mostly in Revelation chapters 4 to 11, and we see the acts of Satan focus mostly in Revelation chapters 12 and 13. I think that will be apparent as we go through these chapters. Now, Revelation chapter 12 is highly symbolic and mysterious. There are some symbols which are clear and others which are not so clear. So as always, want to approach this in a humble manner, but we want to do our best to understand what God is saying. And I think we can get a pretty good grasp of this scripture, but we wanted to be gracious, we want to be humble and accept the things that are still mysterious. Okay, let's get right into the text. We want to read verses 1 to 12 of chapter 12. It reads, "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon and and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns. On his heads were 7 diadems, and his tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth he might devour her child. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. And there was war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. The dragon and his angels waged war, and they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah have come. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, he who accuses them before our God day and night. And they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony. And they did not love their life even when faced with death. For this reason, rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time. And that's where we're stopping for this teaching. There's still about 5 verses left in the chapter that we'll cover in the next teaching. Now, right away, we see 2 signs which appeared in heaven, right? One is the woman with child who's clothed with the sun, moon, and 12 stars. The second is a dragon with 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns or diadems. Now, just to point out that the Greek word for sign is semeion, and this word semeion appears 77 times in the New Testament, 7 times in Revelation. Now, the 7 times that we see it in Revelation, it's used in the following way: 4 times as a miraculous sign, and then 3 times as a sign in heaven, just as we're seeing here in Revelation 12:1 and verse 3, right? So this is actually the first time we see a sign in heaven in the book of Revelation is here in Revelation 12:1. The second time in verse 3, and then the final time, or the third time, is in Revelation 15:1, and that's where it's used of the 7 angels who have the 7 bowl judgments which are poured out upon the earth, right? That actually is where we pick up the days of the sounding of the 7th trumpet again. So it's just kind of interesting here how at the beginning of this interlude, right, in 12:1, we have the first sign, and then the third sign in heaven picks up again where we're getting back into the kind of the timeline of the 7 days of the 7th, the sounding of the 7th trumpet. Okay, now in this chapter, in Revelation chapter 12, there are 4 main symbolic characters. We see the woman, the dragon, the male child, and later we see the other children of the woman, which is in verse 17. We'll get that in the next teaching. Now, there are also named characters in this chapter. For example, the archangel Michael, angels and demons, and God and Satan, right? These are named. They're clearly identified, right? Whereas the other 4 are symbolic. So who does each of these 4 main characters in this chapter represent? The woman, the dragon, the male child, and the other children. Number 2, what is the main purpose of this chapter? And number 3, why is the information in this chapter given in this symbolic manner? And I think simply as we study it, I think we'll understand the answer to number 3, and hopefully we'll be able to answer all these questions as we go through this teaching. So the first sign is this woman, right? Clothed with a crown of 12 stars on her head, clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet. She's pregnant. So who or what does the sign of the woman represent? Where are similar details to this sign found in the Bible? We find it in the story of Joseph and his brothers in Genesis 37. We see a very similar sign. And this is Joseph's the second dream that he received. And we're all familiar with the dreams of Joseph, but I just want to read these three verses here, Genesis 37, 9 to 11, to understand what happened in that context. We read this. Now he had still another dream and related it to his brothers and said, Lo, I have had still another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. He related it to his father and to his brothers. And his father rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. Okay, so we all know about this dream. And in this dream that Joseph had, we see how the sun, moon, and 11 stars were used by God to prophesy how Joseph's own family would bow down to him, right, when he was made ruler in Egypt. Now, with Joseph being the 12th star, right, or one of the 12 sons, we see how this image of the sun, moon, and stars is used to symbolize the family and nation of Israel. Now, why is this significant? The sign of the sun, moon, and stars in Genesis 37 is the first sign used for the people and nation of Israel in the Bible. They're not even a nation yet, right? They're just a family. It's basically, Jacob or Israel and his 12 sons. Now, historically, it's the first time in the Bible when they existed as the 12 sons of Israel, because Benjamin literally was just born, as we read at the end of Genesis 35. He's born, his mother Rachel dies, right? Genesis 36 is the chronology or history of Esau. And then Genesis 37 is the story going back to Israel and his sons, right? And that's the first time they're really existing as the 12 sons, because Benjamin was just born. And then we have this heavenly sign, right? So this heavenly sign of the woman in Revelation chapter 12 seems to emphasize the spiritual plan of God through the people of Israel, right? The nation, the people of Israel, from the beginning, from the time they first existed until the very end, as we're seeing here in Revelation 12, which is connected to the end time. So I think it's just important to see the significance of that symbol and connecting it to the people of Israel, the nation of Israel, going from beginning to end. Now, the second sign in heaven is the great red dragon. Just to read these verses again, just to put it in perspective, Revelation 12, 3 and 4, then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems, and his tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. Okay, so this great red dragon, his tail sweeps away a third of the stars of heaven and hurls them to the earth. This dragon has 7 heads, 7 crowns, and 10 horns. The dragon also stands in readiness before the woman so as to devour her child. So, who does this great red dragon represent with the 7 heads, the 7 crowns, and the 10 horns? We are told later in the chapter exactly who the dragon is, right? We don't need to use too much of our imagination here. We read in verse 9 of chapter 12, and the great red dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Okay, so very clearly, the dragon is the devil, Satan, the serpent of old, who deceives the whole world. We're going to look more at the significance of this verse when we get to it later. But this is a good summary of who Satan is, right? His identity. And it's good to be able to recognize Satan in all of his various forms to understand the deceptive creature he is. Satan is also described in the New Testament as impersonating a holy angel, right? As we read in 2 Corinthians 11:14, even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. And that's why we need to understand his craftiness, his shrewdness, because we can be led to believe something is true when it's not, right? We need to be able to discern the truth from a lie. And that's part of having spiritual discernment. That's part of why we need to continually have the Word of God taught, why we need to continually study it. We need to read it every day, right, to cleanse us, to keep us on the right track. Satan is deceptive. We need to remember that. Now, the reference to Satan as the serpent of old connects Satan to the Garden of Eden, right? That's where we see him as the serpent, and that's the first mention of Satan in the Bible, right? In Genesis chapter 3. The reference to Satan as a serpent also reminds us of the enmity between humanity and Satan, between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, right? This is a very prophetic statement as well, as we know in the scriptures. Going back to that first appearance of Satan. The origin references of both Israel as the woman and Satan, the dragon serpent, going back to the Garden of Eden, reveal the context for Revelation 12 regarding the ongoing spiritual warfare between God and Satan, between the plan of God and the plan of Satan. It's so important to understand these symbols from their origins, right? We're going back to Genesis each time and seeing how this spiritual war is constantly going on. Satan's trying to deceive, kill, and destroy, right? God is trying to bring salvation through a certain nation, through a certain Messiah. Now, the third of the stars, which are swept away by the dragon's tail, represents the fallen angels who followed Satan in his rebellion and continue to serve him today, right? We clearly see that. Those are those angels who went with the evil one. Now, this dragon is identified as Satan. However, he is also representing something more elaborate than himself, right? And I think this is important to understand the details of how he's described with 7 heads, 7 crowns, and 10 horns. Where else is a 7-headed monster seen in the Bible? And hopefully, if you have gone through the Daniel teaching series with us, this should be clear in your mind. It should pop up immediately, right? The description of the dragon with the 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns should automatically remind us of the other prophecies in the scriptures, particularly in Daniel and Revelation. I've listed some of the scriptures here, especially Daniel chapter 7. Then we also see the same dragon in Revelation 13 in the next chapter, and as well as in Revelation chapter 17. So it's a very consistent picture of this monster, this beast, this dragon with 7 heads, right? 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns. And this points to the one world government with the end times ruler, right? The Antichrist leading them all. And it's important to understand, we went through this over and over again in the book of Daniel. We have to put all the pieces of prophecy together. And we can't just simply take one verse here and there. We have to put it all together. So it's just clearly bringing that prophecy of the end times world government and the Antichrist together to understand what will happen in the end times. Now, we also have to remember, as we saw in the book of Daniel, that this 7-headed monster, right, comes out of the 4th kingdom, right? There are clearly 4 kingdoms which are referenced in the prophecies of the book of Daniel, in the 4 beasts of Daniel chapter 7. And that 4th kingdom was fulfilled by Rome, as we can now see historically. But there's also an extension of that 4th kingdom, right? And I don't want to get into the weeds here, but it's just good to put all these pieces together and to remember how this 4th kingdom has been fulfilled in Rome 2,000 years ago. But there's an extension, right? There's the final earthly kingdom that will manifest on this earth in the end times with the Antichrist ruling them all. Now, just as the sign of the woman represents the nation of Israel, so too the sign of the dragon represents both Satan and the final earthly kingdom, right? It's important to see these elements combining. Now, the sign of the dragon as this final world government is important to understand because we'll see this when we get to Revelation 13, but the final world government is powered by Satan and manifested in the beast and the false prophet of Revelation 13. And you have to understand Revelation chapters 12 and 13 as a unit because they really just flow into one another. So we'll see that as we go into Revelation chapter 13. But it's just good to understand the spiritual enablement of Satan for that final world government, and especially the Antichrist, or the beast and the false prophet, as we'll see in Revelation 13. Now, going back to verses 5 and 6 of Revelation 12, we want to return to the woman and her child, right? We read this again in verses 5 and 6. And she gave birth to a son, a male, who is going to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. Okay, so obviously the question is, who is this male child born to the woman? Now, many evangelicals, I could even say most evangelicals, believe that the male child represents the Messiah. And I think this is actually pretty clear from the text and other scriptures. But it was interesting as I was researching this, especially online as well as in some books, to see that there are some evangelicals who believe that the male child represents the quote-unquote church or even Christianity as a religion. And to me, this makes absolutely no sense, and I'm going to explain it more. But just to give you an example here, Matthew Henry, who is a well-known late 17th century Bible commentator, teaches that the woman, whom he believes is the church, gives birth to the male child who represents Christianity. Now, I don't even understand how that can be. I mean, how can you have the church, who is basically the body of Christianity, giving birth to a religion? But this is how he explains it in his book. And I'll even just give you quotes out of his commentary here as he explains the male child in this context. He says this, quote, "The church is represented as a woman, the spouse of Christ and the mother of the saints. Now, how the grand enemy of the church is represented: a dragon for strength and terror, a red dragon for fierceness and cruelty, as standing before the woman to devour her child as soon as it should be born, very vigilant to crush the Christian religion in its birth." So here Henry teaches that the male child is Christianity, who was born of the woman, who is the church. He takes a very different perspective of understanding the symbolism here, right? And this is why it's always good to have the best understanding we can of God's word. Now, there are several reasons why I believe that the text and context of Revelation 12, along with other scriptures, do not support Matthew Henry's position, or any believers today who hold to this position of the male child being Christianity or the woman being the church. Now, number one, we read in verse 5 that this child will one day, quote, rule all the nations with a rod of iron. So I ask an obvious question: has Christianity in the past, or will Christianity in the future, rule the nations with a rod of iron? Do we ever see any kind of prophecy like that in the scriptures? No. Ruling the nations with a rod of iron is a prophecy from Psalm 2:9 that is fulfilled at the second coming of Messiah very clearly. And we actually read about it in Revelation 19:15, which is clearly talking about Yeshua the Messiah descending, right? It's the second coming, his return. And we read this: "From his mouth comes a sharp sword, so that with it he may strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. And he treads the winepress of the fierce wrath of God the Almighty." Right? So clearly, this reference is to the Messiah, and he fits that description of the child who was born of the nation of Israel. Number two, Revelation 12:5 also speaks of the one born of the woman as a son and a child. And this is a clear reference to Isaiah 9:6. We're all familiar with this amazing prophecy. "For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace." Beautiful prophecy. The promise of the son and child are messianic, pointing to Yeshua. And thirdly, read another important detail here: how the child was caught up to God and to his throne. Now, taking this verse in context with the other details which point to the Messiah, I believe this verse is clearly speaking of the ascension of Yeshua to the throne of his Father in heaven after his death and resurrection. Being caught up to God is not necessarily unique. However, being caught up to the throne of God is a unique status and position of the Messiah, as we read in Hebrews 12:2, and there's also in other scriptures, Colossians 3:1. But let me just read this in Hebrews 12:2. Fixing our eyes on Yeshua, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. So, in conclusion, this male child most definitely speaks of Yeshua the Messiah, born from the nation of Israel, the woman who ascended to the Father, who sits at the right hand of the throne of God, and who will one day rule all the nations with a rod of iron. He fits all of the details of this prophecy. The mother symbolized in this account is biblically defined as the nation of Israel and not a specific woman or religion. So I think we can clearly accept this. This is the majority of evangelical teaching. It just fits with the text of Scripture and in the context of Revelation chapter 12. Another question to ask is, has the dragon or Satan attempted to devour the male child, meaning Yeshua the Messiah, fulfilling this prophecy in Revelation 12? Now, historically, Satan tried to destroy the Son of God after his birth through the then reigning fourth kingdom, Rome, with Herod as king over Judea at that time. We're all familiar with the edict of Herod to kill the baby boys in Bethlehem, 2 years old and younger, right? I have the reference there, Matthew 2:16-18, right? So this is clearly a direct link to that event, which at that time when this is being written, right, this is already past tense, but we're seeing this big picture explanation here in Revelation 12. Now, we also know that Satan will try to prevent the coming of Messiah in the end times through the final earthly kingdom with the Antichrist as king of the world during the final 7 years, right? Satan wants to take that place through the Antichrist and reign as the king of the earth. Now, one of the themes of Revelation chapter 12 is to illustrate how Satan is continually fighting against the plan of God, against God's anointed one, the Messiah, and against God's people, right? We're seeing that from beginning to end. Immediately after the ascension of the male child to the throne of God, read about the woman in this way. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. Right? That's verse 6. Now, how do we best understand this verse? So just some questions to consider. When exactly will the woman or nation of Israel flee into the wilderness? Where is this place which God has prepared for Israel? How will God nourish Israel for this period of time? And who exactly will dwell at this refuge of God, this refuge in the wilderness? Now, there are various opinions as to how best to understand this verse, but because of the specific time period of the 1,260 days and the context of the rest of the chapter, it seems best to understand that this to be speaking of the yet future time of the Great Tribulation. Now, since this place of refuge and nourishment is mentioned again at the end of this chapter in verse 14, we will come back to these questions in order to have more clarity. So there's basically a parallel verse from verse 6 in verse 14, and we see how it connects and continues on there. So we'll come back to this subject later, and we'll answer these questions about the woman fleeing into a place of refuge. So let's move on in Revelation 12, verses 7-9, where we read, "And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. The dragon and his angels waged war, and they did not prevail. And there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who was called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him." So here we read about war in heaven, right? There was war in heaven. Now, I asked the question, what does war in heaven look like? And, I don't really even know. We have pictures of this because it illustrates war, but um, heavenly war, spiritual warfare, we get glimpses of it in the scriptures, but what does it really look like? How do they really battle in the heavenlies, right? The forces of evil and the forces of holiness, right? Righteousness. Now, here, Michael and his angels are warring against the dragon and his angels. And I believe that this is really illustrating what I think we know to be true. There's always war in the heavenlies, right? There's always this spiritual warfare going on in a realm that we don't see day to day. But it will end. And that's what we actually read about here in this chapter. Now, as noted earlier, the dragon represents Satan and all of his evil and all of his deception. As we read here in verse 9, we are given these various names and titles of the dragon, the serpent of old, the deceiver, the devil, Satan. What do these names and titles tell us? I just want to go through these different names and titles just to help us to have a better understanding of why I think this verse is here. I think it's very important. Number one, the name Satan comes from the Hebrew word Hasatan, and it simply means the accuser, the adversary, and it's used specifically for Satan. Now, just to say this, in the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament, it can be used of simply an adversary, someone, a person, but it's specifically also used of Satan as the accuser, right? Hasatan. And we'll see an example of that in a minute. Now, the English word devil is simply the Greek equivalent to the Hebrew Satan, right? And so the word devil comes from the Greek word diablos, meaning slanderer or accuser, right? So we're seeing the same thing in two languages, just like Christ and Messiah. They're the same words, really, but the word Christ comes from the Greek. The word Messiah comes from Mashiach, from the Hebrew, right? So it's just important to understand why we use different words. Now, Satan is shown or is illustrated here in Revelation 12 as a dragon. I think it's just to illustrate his destructive intent, right? To kill, steal, and destroy. That is who Satan is as this beast, right? He's also a deceiver. He has been a deceiver since the beginning, and he continues to be a deceiver. And going back to the Garden of Eden, the serpent of old is the first form that Satan takes in the Bible, right? And I think it's an important reminder of how this is how he first appeared on the earth to humanity in his deceptive ways to Adam and Eve. Now, Revelation chapter 12 focuses on the end times, but it also reveals the spiritual battle as it has played out in heaven and on earth since the beginning of creation and until the end times. And this is actually Revelation chapter 12 is a beautifully crafted set of verses that really illustrate this point of this spiritual warfare that's constantly going on in the heavenlies, right? With Satan and his angels against the angels of God, with Michael, the archangel, leading them. It's constantly going on. And then in the end times, we see how it is played out in a little bit different manner. But it's an important reminder there's always spiritual warfare, whether we see it or not. It's going on in the heavenlies. How are we responding to it, right? Are we engaged in it? Do we even understand that it's going on? How are we to fight in this battle? Now, we saw in the book of Daniel, especially in chapter 10, how spiritual warfare continually takes place in the spiritual realm. And Daniel was given a glimpse into that, as we see in this vision that he saw. The battles which are won and lost in the heavens have a direct effect as to what happens on the earth regarding individuals, nations, and kingdoms. Daniel saw this firsthand throughout his life. Now, the snippets of spiritual warfare in the Bible are examples of what is occurring daily, right? We need to understand this is always going on. The Bible is not just some nice stories to read about. It's a reality of what has happened, what is happening, and what will happen. We need to do our best to understand it and to remember our part in this world. Now, for example, in the book of Daniel, we read this when an angel spoke to him in chapter 10, verses 20 to 21. The angel said, "Do you understand why I came to you? but I shall now return to fight against the prince of Persia. So I am leaving, and behold, the prince of Greece is about to come. However, I will tell you what is recorded in the writing of truth. Yet there is no one who stands firmly with me against these forces except Michael, your prince. Right? And then the angel went on and just began to explain all these different events and these different aspects of spiritual warfare that will be played out on earth. And that's all recorded in chapter 11. And then we see how that same angel foretold the events of the end times as we move into Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. I just want to read this verse where it says, Now at that time, Michael, the great prince, who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. Now, what we read here in Daniel 12:1 appears to correlate exactly with what we read in Revelation 12:7-9, right? Michael and his angels will wage war with Satan and his angels, and Satan and his angels, will be thrown to the earth for the 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation. That's the same context of Revelation 12:1. Now, questions arise as to the result of this prophecy about Satan and his angels. How are they even in heaven, right? Why do we see Satan and his angels warring in heaven? How are they even allowed to be there in the first place? Why doesn't God just put up a barrier and not allow them to come in? And we need to remember that there's even a dialogue between Satan and God in the scriptures, which, sometimes we have to move out of our boxes to understand what is going on in the spiritual realm. But we read this account in the book of Job, Job chapter 1. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, From where do you come? Satan answered the Lord and said, From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it, right? So here we see how Satan is able to even come somehow in the near presence of God. And again, I personally find it challenging, right, to understand how do Satan and even his angels even approach the God of heaven and earth, or even fight with his holy angels, right? But this is something that's going on. Now, although Satan has some limited access to God, there will come a day when this will end, as we read in Revelation 12:7-9. At the beginning of the Great Tribulation, Satan and his angels will be cast down to the earth. That's what we read in these verses. And again, we need to understand spiritual warfare continues day and night. And we read the snippets in the Bible, right, with Daniel and the others, but we need to understand these things are always going on. And that's why, just like the prophet Daniel, we need to be continually in prayer, seeking the Lord, understanding what he's saying, listening for his voice, right, and doing our part to fight the spiritual war, relying on the Lord. He is our only real protection in these battles. We need to be alert and continually remember that we are both physical and spiritual beings, right? We are not just simply physical beings and God and his angels are doing the rest. We are also spiritual. We will live into eternity, whether with or without him, depending on what we choose, right? We live in physical bodies. However, we also live and wage war in the spiritual realm with the word of God and by his Spirit. We need to live this out. It can't just be something nice to read about. Now, Ephesians 6 is all well known to us, right? It's a great reminder of how we need to be ready for this battle every day, remembering who we are and what we are fighting against. I just want to read a couple of verses here, verses 10-12 from Ephesians 6, just to remind us how to prepare, right? Where we read these verses, finally be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might, put on the full armor of God, so that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. What a beautiful reminder of this spiritual warfare and how we are to fight. We must acknowledge the spiritual warfare in the heavenly realm in order to fight the daily battles, or we will be deceived by the evil one. We will lose these spiritual battles. Okay, let's look at the last 3 verses here, and we'll bring this lesson, this teaching to a conclusion. So Revelation 12, 10 to 12. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation, the power, and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah have come, for the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, he who accuses them before our God day and night. And they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony. And they did not love their life even when faced with death. For this reason, rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time. So first of all, there's great joy in heaven at the casting down of Satan, who is also called the accuser of our brethren. We're all familiar with this title of Satan, right? Now, it appears that this is Satan's full-time job to constantly come against those who believe in God, who believe in his Messiah. As you read in the text, he who accuses them before our God day and night. He never stops. And I actually was quite convicted as I read this. And I thought, do I ever help out Satan? Am I ever guilty of being one of his assistants, right? Are we quick to accuse others of wrongdoing? Are we guilty of helping Satan to bring accusations against the brethren? And I have to admit, I'm one who loves the truth and loves to debate. And sometimes, we can be quick to accuse others. We need to be careful. There are times when we need to call people out, but we need to be very careful, and we should not be quick to judge, right? We need to be quick to listen and to understand. So we must be careful in how we accuse others, especially fellow believers. We read various examples of Satan accusing others in the scriptures, right? Living up to his name as the accuser of the brethren, Hasatan, the accuser. We read this in Zechariah 3:1. Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. Now, just to point out here, the name Satan, right? It says, and Satan, Vehasatan, that's in Hebrew. And to accuse him, that phrase is lesitno, which is the same root. If you can see the letters, shin, tet, nun, right? That's Satan. So the name Satan, to accuse, we see that perfectly illustrated here in Zechariah 3:1. That is who he is. That is what he does. He constantly accuses. In the first 2 chapters of Job, the Lord spoke well of his servant Job, as we see in Job 1:8. The Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. Right? Job was someone who had faith. He walked with God. He feared God. The Lord knew Job and spoke well of his blameless life as he walked with God. On the other hand, Satan spoke evil of Job, accused Job, and said that Job would lose his faith and do evil if pressed hard enough, right? And we read this in Job 1:9 and 11. Then Satan answered the Lord, does Job fear God for nothing? But put forth your hand now and touch all that he has. He will surely curse you to his face, curse you to your face, right? This is the accusation of Satan. Satan is the accuser. God, as we read in the scriptures, is love. Let's imitate God and not Satan, right? It's easy to accuse. We need to learn to love. Love is patient. We read this famous scripture, 1 Corinthians 13:4-7. Love is patient. Love is kind, is not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own, is not provoked. It does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Right? This is the picture of who God is. God is love. We need to remember who the accuser is, Satan, and who God is, and let us imitate God. Now, what is our only defense against Satan and his accusations? According to what we have read, our defense is the same as for those who are in the end times, as we read in this verse, Revelation 12:11, and they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony. and they did not love their life even when faced with death. Our continual defense is in the blood of the Lamb and in testifying to who he is. That is it. That is how we defeat the enemy. Confessing that it is only the blood of the Lamb that cleanses us from our sin and gives us the victory in this life is our key defense. Each and every one of us who believes in Yeshua has a testimony to declare. It's not our story. It's about how God worked in our lives, right? It's all about him. It's about who Yeshua is, how he saved us from our sin and from the plan of the evil one, from the plan of Satan, right? We need to remember and declare who he is. And this is our victory. This is our defense. This is how we win the battles every day and spend eternity with him. There will be great joy in heaven when Satan and his angels lose the battle that casts them out of heaven, but there will be a cry of woe on the earth and in the sea. Why? Because as we read in 12:12, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time. Now, how much time will Satan have? It is the 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation when Satan will unleash his wrath on the earth. And this is confirmed as we will look at in the rest of the chapter here, Revelation 12, 13 to 14. It's in that context of the 3.5 years. It's clearly talking about that. And this is where Satan will unleash his wrath, right? So in conclusion to this teaching, I just want to highlight again the two main themes in Revelation chapter 12 as I see them. Number one, it's this war which continues in heaven, this spiritual battle from creation until the end, right? From the serpent in the garden until the end times, the time of the Great Tribulation. Now, the second theme is that during the final years of the Great Tribulation, the war which has been in heaven will be manifested on the earth. Satan and his angels are cast down to the earth, and Satan will unleash his wrath on the earth. The final years of the 7 years, right? The 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation. And again, it's just important to remember this because we often think about the 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation as the wrath of God being poured out. But it is also the wrath of Satan being unleashed on the earth. It's both things are happening, right? Satan is having a particular target, a specific target, as he unleashes his wrath on the earth. And God specifically targets those who take the mark of the beast, right? We've already seen that in part. And in these chapters, we see Satan specifically, how his time is given during this 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation. Now, in light of what the future holds, let us be praying for the kingdom of God to come as Yeshua taught his disciples. Quote, pray then in this way, our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, right? There's a spiritual battle that's continually going on, and we need to be continually focused on Yeshua, on the kingdom of God, and on his will being done on earth as it is in heaven. Let us remember that our defense in these days and until the end is in the blood of the Lamb and in testifying to who he is, right? We constantly pray on our knees, we constantly seek him, and our defense is the blood of the Lamb and testifying to who he is. That is our defense. This is our greatest weapons in these days and especially in the end times. So this is the conclusion to Revelation 12, part 1, on earth as it is in heaven. And hopefully we see clearly how from beginning to end in this chapter, there's a painting of this picture of the spiritual warfare, right? That is constantly going on in the heavens. And then we see how Satan and his angels, his demons, are thrown down to the earth during the final 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation, and how there will be such an intensity of the spiritual warfare on the earth at that time. We will really see it before our eyes like never before. Okay, so that is the conclusion to this teaching. We'll get more into we'll finish Revelation 12 in the next teaching. So please read ahead and try to read through that chapter a few times before we look at it in the teaching. Here's some of the resources I use in my preparation. And as always, feel free to share this teaching with others. And we also welcome you to donate to our ministry so we can continue to make these teachings available to you and others. Now, I just want to make a note here. In the middle of your screen, you may see two websites, the regular LeRaglai.com website. There's also the Psalm119.105.org website. Some people mentioned, as well as my father, who's 86 years old, it was difficult for him to remember the website name of LeRaglai, since it's a Hebrew phrase, right? Lamp unto my feet. But this simply comes from the reference Psalm 119.105. So I've also put this, bought this website. So now both websites go to the same place. So if you go to either one, but if you ever want to share the website with another person, simply share with them Psalm119.105.org, right? Simple to remember. So thanks so much and see you again next time.